Dawn broke with rain and hail in Washington, D.C. The capital was less a city than a group of villages, and its dirt streets were covered in mud 10 inches deep. Still, thousands walked to the Capitol to watch the president's inaugural speech. Lincoln's new vice president, Tennessee Democrat Andrew Johnson, was sworn in first in front of Congress. His speech that day would leave an impression that strangely showed what his unexpected presidency would be like just 6 weeks later. Johnson drank several glasses of whiskey before he went to be sworn in, so he gave a speech in which he was slurring his words and getting lost. It was embarrassing. He started to give a drunk speech about how he was a common man, a man of the people. He began to mention members of the cabinet there, and he could not really remember their names. He even had to be pulled down by his coat by another member of the cabinet. This was not a good sign. Narrator: As the only Southern senator to stay in the Union during the Civil War, Johnson was chosen as vice president to create a national unity ticket with Lincoln. But the plan failed when John Wilkes Booth fired that shot in Ford's Theater. Andrew Johnson was suddenly the leader of a country still divided by war and a government divided by party. Andrew Johnson was basically leading a Republican government, but he was not a Republican. He was a Democrat. So now you have a president who was elected by one party but belongs to another, with a Congress mostly from the opposite party. He was going to have problems, serious problems. Narrator: Andrew Johnson was no stranger to hardship. The very poor boy from Tennessee taught himself to read and write and worked his way up from a servant to a small-town tailor to a U.S. senator to the 17th President of the United States. But the strong attitude he developed along the way was not a good fit for the highest office in the country. He had no tact. He was like a fighter from the frontier. That is what had helped him get where he was. People who become President of the United States often think, it is because I have these traits and have lived this way my whole life. So they are not going to change their ways. Following Abraham Lincoln would have been almost impossible for any president. Lincoln was great in terms of his emotions, his kindness, his friendliness, his good nature, and his political skill, which was very, very strong. So Johnson did have a problem. Narrator: The nation was desperate for a strong leader who could bring the United States back together. It would be an almost impossible job. 15% of the nation had taken up arms against each other. More than 600,000 soldiers had died. The war left the Southern economy destroyed, and more than half of its towns were controlled by Union troops. Andrew Johnson wanted to bring the Southern states back into full membership of the Union as quickly as possible. He did not want to pay any big price, so Johnson was on a different path from Congress, and it was ready for conflict. And there was conflict. Narrator: Johnson quickly took control and started his plans while Congress was not meeting. The sessions were very short. Members came in for a short time, 5 months, met from December to May, and left before D.C. got hot. So Johnson was in control of what the first months of Reconstruction would be like, and what he did was say that when former Confederates ask for pardons and are forgiven by me, then they can come back into the Union. Andrew Johnson was ready to give a lot of freedom to the Southern states. He believed they should mostly rebuild themselves. Narrator: Johnson gave orders for the states that had left the Union to hold elections and announced 2 simple conditions for the Southern states to be allowed back into the Union and Congress. Southern states must agree that leaving the Union was illegal, not valid, and they must accept the 13th Amendment. They must agree that slavery was over forever. Those were the conditions that were set, but the North wanted more than that. The radical Republicans in Congress wanted to punish the South more, and they also believed that African Americans in the South should gain rights much closer to equality than before. Narrator: The passing of the 13th Amendment at the end of 1865, had freed more than 4 million slaves. In open opposition, the Southern state governments responded by creating what were called the Black Codes. A black person without a job could be forced into any kind of labor. Any black child could be taken from their family and made to work, and they could be sold for up to a year of their labor. What does that sound like? Does it sound like slavery to you? Narrator: the Republican-controlled Congress was angry, seeing these laws as a way to keep the old slavery system alive. A full political war began between Johnson and Congress, who believed the president was being too easy on the South. Johnson said, "This is basically a continuation of war powers. I can do what I want." And Congress said, "No, you cannot." There was no longer a war, so Congress did not need to follow him because it was no longer an emergency. And so it did everything it could to take back power and make Congress the center of decisions. When Johnson vetoes the Civil Rights Act, there is a sudden realization that this man cannot be trusted. They believed Johnson was going beyond Lincoln's plans. Narrator: for only the 8th time in the nation's 90-year history, Congress overrode the president's veto and the Civil Rights Bill passed. Over the next 3 years, Johnson gave 21 vetoes, more than George Washington, James Madison, Andrew Jackson, and Abraham Lincoln combined. Congress overrode 71% of them, the highest for any president. Johnson did not like to negotiate. He did not like to discuss. He just wanted to act. And so Johnson was not an effective president, and the Republicans in Congress got their way. Narrator: the fight next moved into the 1866 congressional elections. Johnson set a new example by becoming the first president to actively campaign against the opposing political party. He went on a tour he called a swing around the circle. Andrew Johnson went from Washington up to New York and then across the Northwest all the way to Chicago, supporting his plan of Reconstruction and attacking radical Republicans at every train stop. So it turned into a disaster. It was the most counterproductive speaking tour in American presidential history. Republicans won the congressional elections of 1866 by a huge margin. A mix of radical and moderate Republicans held a 2-3 majority in Congress, so that any veto Johnson might make could be overturned because they had enough power. Narrator: a struggle for power between the two branches quickly followed. They passed a Reconstruction Act that reversed much of what he had done, and then they created the Tenure of Office Act, which did not allow Johnson to fire a cabinet member without the Senate approving it. Andrew Johnson naturally wanted to be able to fire people who worked for him, and Congress said, "No, you cannot." Narrator: Johnson was not going to give up any of his executive power. Defying the Republican Congress, he fired the Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, a Republican and a Lincoln supporter. Congress immediately saw this as the first step to use military force to take control of the War Department so that he could control the Army and use it for unknown purposes. It is not very surprising that he became the first president to be impeached. The level of distrust and anger was extreme during this presidency. On February 24, 1868, Congress, for the first time, impeached a sitting president on 11 charges of high crimes and wrongdoing. Johnson's fate would be decided in a trial by the Senate 3 and 1 to 2 months later. No one knew for sure how the vote would go. It was very close. A few senators, there was a feeling they might vote one way or the other. It was not clear. Imagine a day where one of the senators was very sick and had to be carried in on a chair to vote. Narrator: it would take a 2-3 vote in the Senate to convict him. At that time, that meant 36 votes, and there were 45 Republicans in the Senate. The vote was 35 to convict and 19 to free him. Johnson escaped by 1 vote. They believed that it would likely weaken the presidency forever and shift too much power to Congress. Narrator: but Johnson's victory meant little. He had no real power, and he had damaged the office of the president. During the entire Johnson-Citoyen's presidency, it was mainly a struggle about who had power, the president or Congress. And in the end, it was clear that Congress won this struggle. Extra police were placed on the streets to stop an expected wave of public celebrations. New York celebrated with bright-colored electric lights. America was changing with new inventions. Cars, radios, movies were changing the nation. And Theodore Roosevelt would prove to be the right man for the right time. He would change the role of president from an administrator to a visionary leader. Richard Norton Smith. In many ways, Theodore Roosevelt is the first modern president. The debate we are having now about executive power is one he would understand, because he started it a century ago. Theodore Roosevelt, as a boy, was weak and had asthma. Theodore Roosevelt's father said to him as a young boy, "Theodore, you have the mind, but you do not have the body. And without the body, the mind cannot go as far as it should." George C. Edwards III. So he made himself stronger, he learned to box, went out west, worked on ranches, built his body. And he made himself do many things that created this remarkable adult. Bruce McGill. Morgan fought him all the way to the Supreme Court, where Roosevelt won. A new example was set, allowing the president to have a wider view of his power. He clearly said that he looked at the Constitution and asked, "Does it say I cannot do it?" And if it did not say he could not, then he believed he could. In Congress, many lawmakers did not agree with Roosevelt about his vision for America. They wanted to continue doing business the old way. Stephen M. Gillen. Roosevelt inherited the office. He was not elected. He had Democrats he had to deal with. His own Republican Party was divided. You have to understand that Roosevelt had no clear mandate, but he created one. He had a vision of the presidency. He wanted to use it as a strong platform to change America. Bruce McGill. Whether it was through strong speeches or the press, Roosevelt's goal was to build a plan by gaining public support. Theodore Roosevelt came into office determined to create a modern presidency. He was not going to connect with the American people through layers of government, the state legislature, the Congress, the political parties. He wanted to build a direct connection. They took their case to the public to convince Congress, and presidents had not done that before. They did not go out and speak for policies. Now, it is very common. Randy Roberts. He had a way to get publicity that no one else had. TR really started the idea of a celebrity president. Bruce McGill. Americans did not just have a growing interest in their president. They were excited by many new things spreading across the nation. Cheering, yearly baseball attendance went from 1 million to 7 million. People were buying 10 million bicycles a year. And they loved Italian opera singer Enrico Caruso, making him the first artist to sell 1 million copies of one recording. The country's fast changes were often front-page news, and Roosevelt knew it would help him politically if he was connected to them. He was the president who welcomed new technology. He was the first president to ride in a car. He was the first president to fly in an airplane. Stephen M. Gillen. The key is that Roosevelt was photographed doing all these things, which kept him in the public eye. And by doing this, he increased the visibility of the presidency. Bruce McGill. He gave interviews while being shaved. He met with the French ambassador while hiking. And he never stopped speaking. Theodore Roosevelt. I am leading because someone must lead, or the fight would not happen at all. Bruce McGill. He kept a large personal staff to write down his ideas. 4 typists, 6 stenographers, 6 messengers, and several clerks. Roosevelt also turned his personal life into publicity. Theodore Roosevelt knew that this was attractive to voters. He was a young, strong man with a large family, with children running all around the White House. And so Theodore Roosevelt sometimes brought his children into the spotlight. Bruce McGill. Every day at 4 p.m., Roosevelt had Children's Hour, reading or playing with his 6 children, including games of hide and seek in the White House. Richard Norton Smith. He created the modern presidential family. There is a direct connection from TR's family to John F. Kennedy's family. Both became popular. Both became part of our extended family through the media of their time. Bruce McGill. To make room for his large family and heavy workload, Roosevelt began the biggest renovation in White House history. He added a new West Wing to expand office space. The modern Oval Office would later be created in that space in 1934 by his cousin, Franklin Roosevelt. TR also officially renamed the mansion. Before his presidency, the place where the president lived was called the Executive Mansion. Theodore Roosevelt decided, how can people connect with something called Executive Mansion? So he changed the name of the president's home to the White House, so it became a symbol of the people's house. Bruce McGill. But Roosevelt's changes to the presidency went much deeper than renaming the building and breaking walls. He was reshaping the office to match his own personality. Theodore Roosevelt needed to be in the spotlight. As his daughter said, "To understand my father, you must realize he must be the bride at every wedding and the corpse at every funeral." He was the first president to strongly use presidential power on his own to get things done. That means acting without waiting for Congress to pass laws. Randy Roberts. Theodore Roosevelt had very little patience for the slow lawmaking process. Get it done yesterday. Get it done even earlier. And so he found ways to get things done, like executive orders. I will just sign an order. Done. 1933. On March 4th, Franklin Delano Roosevelt arrived at the Capitol to take the oath of office and become the 32nd President of the United States. Unable to walk on his own after a 13-year fight with polio, Roosevelt wore leg braces under his clothes, but was still able to take a few short but strong steps to the stage. Randy Roberts. It had been raining for the week before the inauguration in Washington, D.C., and as he came to take the oath of office, the sun actually came out. Narrator. Before a crowd of 100,000 at the Capitol and millions listening on the radio, FDR recited the 35-word oath from memory and then gave one of the most famous speeches ever by a president. After years of economic decline and near hopelessness, when millions of Americans had almost lost hope, this man appeared suddenly. And in one speech, he began to meet the emotional needs of the country. So first of all, let me say my strong belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. A key part of any president is to build confidence. It was important that the American people could hear him say, "There are leaders here in Washington who will take control." Narrator. FDR was carrying out his promise from the 1932 election, offering a new deal to the American people. He had won 42 states and 57% of the popular vote. In Congress, Republicans lost over 100 seats to Democrats, the biggest change in nearly 40 years, giving Roosevelt a strong majority in both the House and the Senate. But he was not clear on how he would use it. Franklin Roosevelt came into office with great hope. No one knew exactly what he would do. Amity chalets. Roosevelt believed in action for action's sake. Even if it was wrong, it was okay. The humorist, Will Rogers, said, "You know, if he had burned down the Capitol or the White House, we would have said, 'Good, at least he started something.'" That is how bad things felt in 1932. The first thing he did was declare a bank holiday, basically shutting down banks across the country. There was serious doubt whether this was allowed by the Constitution, and Americans were worried enough that they were willing to accept it. Then the next thing he did was find a way to save the banking system, mostly as it was. Narrator: 10,000 banks had failed since 1929. With Congress strongly supporting him, Roosevelt passed the Emergency Banking Relief Act, which reorganized the EBE system and, most importantly, guaranteed deposits for the first time. H.W. Brands. The next morning, when banks reopened, lines formed again outside. But now people stood in line to put money into banks, and within 2 weeks, the banking crisis was solved. Narrator: Roosevelt also knew he needed something that would lift people's spirits, so he signed a law allowing some alcohol sales again, saying, "I think this would be a good time for a beer." On April 7th, thousands stood outside bars and shops to enjoy their first legal drink in 14 years. Roosevelt had that positive energy as a leader, and that was important to voters, especially during the Depression. George C. Edwards III. The first 100 days is probably the most famous period of success in Congress in all of American history. He gathered his advisors and quickly created laws and sent them to Congress. Fast, 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 and they passed them, major laws one after another. Narrator: the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Civil Works Administration, the Public Works Administration, the Tennessee Valley Authority. Roosevelt showed strong effort and commitment to solving every part of the Depression. Roosevelt showed the same qualities in dealing with the Depression that he once used to deal with polio. It was that sense of determination and endless optimism, a willingness to try different ideas, which became the key part of his style of leadership. But most importantly, what he did was, he showed, as Andrew Jackson had 100 years earlier, as Lincoln had at the time of Fort Sumter, great leaders do not just manage a crisis. They use the crisis to build a strong emotional bond with the people. Narrator: Roosevelt was very concerned about being seen as a strong leader for the country, so he carefully shaped his public image. Anyone who met him was surprised to see him in a wheelchair, because there were only 2 photos that showed him in it, and neither was published while he was alive. Narrator: FDR soon realized his real power was in being heard, not seen. While Harding in 1922 was the first president heard on radio, and Coolidge the first to speak regularly, Roosevelt mastered radio with his weekly talks, his fireside chats. "My friends, you and I agree that security is our greatest need. The chance to work, the chance to make a fair profit in our business." There was an instant connection, and the White House was flooded with letters. Suddenly, they had to hire many people to handle all the mail. There was something about radio that made people feel closer and want to respond. Narrator: FDR's approach was a huge success. Even though the country was still in the Depression, still facing high unemployment, the American people trusted their president. In the 1936 election, they gave Roosevelt the biggest victory in